One, two.
I'll be right back. Because there is no teaching for me. Yeah. So I don't have to pay anything, but the teaching I'll have to draft here, which I'm sure I'll find.
Take a peek at it.
Yeah. Look, I don't know what she wrote to them, but it impressed me so much. Okay. I'm not going to ask you the question I should ask. Congratulations to you. You made it happen.
We were saying this internship lesson is true. So they're going to bring in another mic. Get a moment, put on your mic. No, you're going to. Okay, but as we said, like you see it. I'm going to ask.
You give Brother Orlando a hug for me, man.
Yeah, we can stand those back and forth.
But I didn't give you one?
They only have two. He's going to bring one in.
No, you take mine, man. Brother, just like to come to my elders.
Indeed.
You take that, man. I might just be speaking to his point.
Great. Absolutely.
All right, here we go.
So let us go ahead and get started. And first, a quick statement about what we'll be doing today. One of the several larger arguments of this course is that through comparative philosophy, in other words, by taking ideas seriously from various traditions, it will help challenge some of our fundamental assumptions and thereby, hopefully, produce the possibilities of truly either new thinking or something I'll be coming back later in my discussions, old thinkings that will actually revolutionize current assumptions. In part, out of the hope that this is indeed going to be the case, the work of comparative philosophy, today we will actually be doing that work of comparison. So I will be beginning with some rather grand generalizations about the Western and Chinese philosophical traditions. The goal will be to hopefully provoke some larger discussions. And then, as always, we will indeed open things up for larger discussion. And again, the larger theme will be, can we, hopefully the answer will be yes, but we'll see in practice, can we, through this comparative work, help to provoke larger ways of thinking? So, to do so, let me begin with these grand generalizations. Needless to say, anytime one makes grand generalizations, there are often more exceptions than there are things that fit the rule. So, if this is going to be helpful, we'll see in practice if it is usefully provocative. With that in mind, let us jump in. So, if you think in terms of the developments of philosophical traditions, in terms of problems, problematics, issues that people wrestle with, what is it that really makes a tradition tick? Let me begin with the Western tradition and make some grand generalizations along these lines. One of the things that has proved so powerful about the Western philosophical tradition is an incredible attempt to grapple with the possibility, and the argument is truly real fact in many cases, that the world is not what it seems. Much of this has taken the form of claiming radical views that run directly counter to the world of experience, arguing that that counter-reality is in fact the accurate one, and that we should rethink our basic assumptions, we should rethink the social world, and we should rethink our understanding of the natural and metaphysical worlds accordingly. Certainly one of, not the only as we'll see, but certainly one of the dominant forms this has taken is a strong claim that you see beginning at least as early as Plato, and arguably even with some of the pre-Socratics, depending on how one reads them, that in contrast to the world that we experience, a world of constant change, flux, of becoming, there is, on the contrary, a world of being. A world where everything exists purely in a stable form, unmutable, unchangeable, and that there is some inherent piece of us that is both a part of that world and therefore, for that exact reason, has an experience of it and can understand it. In the particular form, which will become extraordinarily influential that this takes in Plato, that argument runs along the following lines. There is, again, contrary to the world that we experience, a realm of ideas where everything is singular and perfectly present and unchanging. So we see a world of tables, but what is the idea, the perfect form, not of the table, but of the form, that all the various forms that we experience would take? We are capable of experiencing this because we have a soul. That soul is of that larger world. It is, therefore, able to experience it because we have personally experienced that world. And the work of philosophical training is aimed to allow us to once again see that world, and for the rest of humanity who does not, to help them reach that higher level as well. Or, if they cannot, at the minimum, to guide them properly by those who can truly see it. Immediately, you see in the tradition also many of the tensions that will arise from this sort of a claim. Once you get this argument, it raises, of course, an obvious set of questions. Is there such a realm? That becomes hotly debated. But of course, if you want to deny there is such a realm, then how do you get the philosophical power that you are finding in the tradition by saying that there is? Number two, precisely who has access to it? If, as in the case of Plato, we all have a soul and all of those souls have access, it is certainly the case in Platonic philosophy that not all of us have equal access to it. And what is the definition by which a philosopher would be able to achieve it? What is the definition that one can become a philosopher? And how truly open is that access to the larger world? And if that seeking occurs by the philosopher, however widely accessible, and that experience begins to occur, what happens if that experience wavers? And what happens if, in fact, what you're experiencing ends up being more complicated than you were initially led to believe with the initial training exercise? You can see all of these questions sort of put in kind of hint form in many of the dialogues, but they all begin to play out immediately over the subsequent centuries. So in the Greek tradition, you could argue a significant power that's driving that tradition is wrestling with these various issues. So most famously, Aristotle will, of course, say, well, there's no realm of ideas in that sense, and yet it's immediately important for Aristotle that we don't simply accept the world as currently given. And so the key for Aristotle, then, is how do you take what we would define as a more empirical view of the world that still nonetheless provides the power of what Plato is seeking? This will continue. To give a few more examples of how this will begin to play out. When later in the tradition you start getting definitions of how that distinction should be made between being however defined and becoming the world that we currently exist in, with again the realm of philosophy aiming ultimately at that, what you will start finding are the following sets of claims. That metaphysically speaking, true metaphysics, the study of what truly is always going to be concerned with being. The strong tendency in the tradition is to define being in terms of non-changing states of pure being, to use a tautology. In other words, that world of being is unchanging, and that is the true world. The world that we experience is lesser, oftentimes in some respects derived from it, and regardless, at some level fallen from that higher being. And again, the study of the philosopher should always be aimed at that higher level of being. Always. Then, of course, playing out exactly the concerns we saw sort of traceable into the Greek tradition, the constant concern is what happens when that begins to break down. And how do you gain that same kind of dynamic that was seen as so crucial to the problematic of Western philosophy if you cannot, at least you feel you cannot, assert some realm of higher being? Where this finally will take the tradition is the beginnings of what we now, I think some sort of taking the self-definitions seriously, would call modern philosophy, beginning particularly with Kant. So one of the key moves that Kant is going to try to make with all of this is to give you all of the power of what he sees as the Western tradition, this dynamic of being and becoming, without a claim that we, as human beings, have any access to a realm of being whatsoever. And the way he will try to argue this is to say, let's turn it around. And let us, on the contrary, assume that the world of our experience is simply a construct of humans. However, that construct, because we all as humans construct the world, that construct can itself become the basis for philosophy. And then the goal of philosophy is to say, if we all humans are constructing the world of our experience, how do we construct that world properly? How do we construct that world properly? And how then do we gain the same kind of a dynamic tension that so animated the earlier tradition? And the argument is, if you're turning this around, the realm of what an earlier philosophy had called being would be unknowable. His word is, it's the noumenon. It's the thing in itself. We have no access to it. We must admit we have no access to it. We have no way of speaking about it. All of previous Western philosophy was a mistaken attempt to think that we actually could speak about the thing in itself, whereas we can't, and therefore it was all wrong. But what we can speak about philosophically is the world of our experience done properly. And then if it's done properly, what you begin to say, what for him you must say, is what are the proper conditions of understanding that would allow us to live properly if we understand that we are constructing the world of our experience. And then the dynamic tension that for him dominated the tradition begins to play out at that level. So it is not that the world that we are living in, that we construct, is a good world. It's that we must construct it properly, and if we so construct it, then we will finally have a philosophy that can properly speak of the world as, again, a construct, but again, in universal terms. That is his move with metaphysics. His move with ethics is very comparable. The move with ethics is, again, to say, if we cannot claim there is some realm of being that will tell us what to do, some kind of foundational vision that will guide us in our actions, what we must do, on the contrary, is universalize all of our human constructs. And the quick version of Kantian ethics is to say, I must never act in a way that could not be universalizable. So why should I not kill someone? Because I could not universalize killing people by definition, and insofar as I could not universalize it, it therefore should never be done. And the argument is not that you're in a complex world and we're learning to navigate that world. What he wants is, again, the same thing that earlier philosophy was calling foundational ethics, being as such, but he's saying you gain it through the universalizability of human constructs. We universalize our ethics, and that gives you the same power that the earlier tradition gave without any claim that we actually have access to some kind of foundational vision. This has really become, I would argue, in many ways, the basis of modern Western philosophy. We're all Kantians, basically. And what I mean by that is as follows. When probably I was describing Kantian philosophy, you probably were not thinking, yeah, this is all what we kind of assume. But I'm going to try to make the argument it is actually what we all kind of assume. And the way I'm going to make that argument is to say, much of our commonsensical assumptions that are now dominant in the world are kind of a taking of a Kantian vision, moving it into a different register, but basically repeating Kant's overall vision. What I mean by that is the following. Basically, we are doing the same things Kant was doing, minus, exactly as Kant was trying to do as well, any vision of some kind of a higher being, but where we locate that is simply within the self. We don't tend to think in terms of the universal constructs of space and time, universalizable ethics, but note the way we do talk about it, which is very telling. Most of our commonsensical assumptions about how to live a good life, about how to live a proper life, about how to build a better world, both socially and even scientifically, comes down to the human self. And the argument basically is, all of us have some kind of foundational basis within us that gives the way of understanding the world. Again, a pre-Kantian philosophy would say that's because we have a soul that has access to being. It's because we have a soul that has access to God. You are making some kind of transcendental claim. Most of us don't necessarily assume that, but rather we make the exact same move, simply moving it into the human realm. We have some kind of true self. Following that true self, I will be able to act well in the world. It is always the ground by which I judge everything else. This is not true to me. This is not true to my experience. This is not true to who I really am. As we mentioned in the previous 2 weeks, a common statement we'll make to ourselves is, ethically, I should always be trying to be authentic and true to who I really am. And if I do the same with everyone else, I'm learning to love and embrace all of those who are equally sincere and authentic to who they are. I critique those who are not genuine to who they truly are, critique myself by the same token. In other words, we're basically making a move that instead of claiming some access to being, we gain the exact same thing by simply moving it to the human realm. There is a tension between the world of our experience and some kind of true realm. That true realm is, again, no longer located in the realm of the ideas or a deity. It is rather located within. And yet that exact same tension gives us, we think, the kind of tension we need to motivate our behavior and change ourselves and the world for the better. And insofar as we do that, we see ourselves as constructing a human world, but again, with some kind of a foundation. That means it's not simply an arbitrary construction, some kind of a foundation that is guiding us. To put this in very strong terms, hopefully in a provocative way, the move is basically still foundational. It is basically still a claim that truth belongs in the realm of being, some kind of stable, unchanging foundation. And the tension with the world as we experience it is hopefully going to be dealt with by constantly returning to that foundation. If it's no longer located in the external world, or again in a higher deity, it is located within, and yet you're still gaining that same exact tension. I would also note, however, in the kind of commonsensical version that's now taken hold, what we, of course, are losing is exactly what made Kant so powerful, like it or not, but what made him so powerful which is that tension was worked out in incredibly stark detail. The danger of the way it's becoming commonsensical now is that, in essence, what we really ended up doing is basically saying the world as it exists is basically okay as long as we are just authentic and sincere about it. Which means that tension with the world that has been so productive in the Western tradition has now been so domesticated that if we follow our own ideology, it essentially means we give up on the power and revolutionary projects that at its, I would say, height, has been so powerful in the Western tradition. That's the danger of the way it's currently worked out. Now, let me now pick up that latter theme on the revolutionary side of this, because if that's what we've in part lost, it's important to note, I don't think that's an inherent problem in the Western tradition. In fact, if anything, it's one of its powers. And so let me now say a few words about that. If the current version of all of this is sort of replicating very old patterns of thinking, and yet we've lost what I would say, for many of us, would be its most exciting power, what is it that really animated that? And I'd like to make the argument that what animated it is precisely that focus on attention. The focus on the idea that the world of our experience is somehow lesser. And in one version, of course, it could mean a retreat for the philosophical soul to experience the realm of ideas. That's certainly been a significant theme in the Western tradition. But at its most powerful, it can also take the exact opposite form, which is that we should radically alter the world that we are currently living in according to some higher foundational vision. That higher foundational vision, again, can be found someplace metaphysically, it can be found in the realm of God, it can be found in some kind of foundational truth. Yes, in the more modern isms, it can be found in some definition of the human self. However, it's always been, at its most productive, this vision that the world that we currently experience ought to be altered, and it should be altered by some foundational sense that is radically counterintuitive to the world of our experience. If that is what we have lost, it is important to note, when one wants to wrestle with the powers of the Western tradition, that, I think, is the impulse we should be wrestling with. And let me also note that that shift is not inherent in the shift to what is, again, a self-defined post-Kantian modern philosophy. Indeed, I would argue that tension has, for better and worse, we'll get back to this later, played out in its most significant forms in the past 2 centuries. The form that this takes in the post-Kantian world, not the current find yourself model, but the power that it took in the 19th and 20th centuries, were based upon these claims that you begin with some kind of a foundational notion of what human nature is. You try to envision what a totalizing order would be if that was the world we lived in. In other words, it's not the world we live in, but what would it mean to live in it? You come up with a utopian-ism of what that world would be like. And then, because you're not locating that being in ideas above or in some kind of a deity, but rather in a human project in the post-Kantian world, then the idea is you radically try to transform the world to be that utopian vision. Whether that be a communist vision, a socialist vision, a capitalist vision, but this is the world of the great isms. Extraordinary attempts to not simply ask to note the tension between our experience and some kind of foundational other, but to actually alter dramatically that world to make it achieve some kind of stronger vision of what a perfect utopia would be. That has been both the power and, for obvious reasons, the dangers of the modern version of how this has played out in the past 2 centuries. So with that as a grand set of generalizations, let me turn to the Chinese tradition, which is going to be very different, intriguingly. And that's, I think, going to be one of the central issues we need to wrestle with. So let me begin by making a few points on just the issues I've raised and then draw out the differences. It's often said, and I think not quite correctly, that you don't see any of what I just mentioned in the Chinese tradition. That, I think, is just empirically not the case. So, importantly, in terms of even the metaphysical claims, I'll make a strong statement, and I'd love to hear an exception if anyone can think of it. I'm not sure any of the positions that we have mentioned don't pop up in the Chinese tradition. They all do. And so just to give you a very significant example, there was an early religious movement or philosophical movement, but again, as I keep saying, these philosophical movements in antiquity are not academic philosophy. They're philosophical, they're religious, oftentimes there's a sort of millenarian impulse to them. There's one group called the Moists, which actually repeats many of the views we've been talking about. I mean, it argues explicitly there is a higher deity. That deity is called heaven. That deity is the source of all proper senses of what is good. It's a foundational view. That deity created the world that we are living in. That world that we are living in is now a fallen world because of what we humans have improperly done. We have therefore created a fallen world. Our goal is now to follow the higher teachings of heaven and radically reform, the world that we are currently living in to meet that higher vision. This becomes an incredibly powerful movement. They literally form militias and actually try to reorganize the world. When it dies out, you see the same themes popping up in millenarian movements throughout Chinese history of incredibly powerful force. Mao, needless to say, very much sees himself as coming out of these radical millenarian traditions. So that is a very powerful force in the Chinese tradition. But my examples are telling us the larger point. We are talking about movements radically trying to reform the world, which now being an exception, but until that, these were radical millenarian movements that kind of died out. They were not the mainstream of Chinese philosophy. The positions are there, but they don't become the dominant form. And rather, the ways that these very, in some ways, similar tensions will be played out, but what will become by far the dominant push in Chinese philosophy, will in part be organized against many of these assumptions, explicitly against many of these assumptions, with an argument that, on the contrary, the way you try to actually build a better world is through radically different approaches. And since they were wrestling with many assumptions that have, again, been so significant in the Western tradition, it's intriguing for us to look at what they were trying to do. And in this particular case, we have 2,000 years of history to then say, what are the implications of following some routes as opposed to other routes? The pluses and minuses, and what would it mean to learn from each? So let's then turn to what becomes, on the contrary, in a sense, sort of the central pushing tensions of the Chinese tradition. It is not, and explicitly so, you'll get strong critiques of this. You've already seen it a bit in both the Analects and the Mencius, the little pieces that we've read from the tradition. It is not based upon a claim that there is some foundational other that we need to be following. In fact, that position, which again is being articulated, is explicitly rejected. Mencius lived after the Moists, and you'll find many critiques and angry critiques. And the view is just, that's not the direction to go. That is simply wrong. And let me actually focus a few moments on Mencius and that critique, because it's very telling, because it will become, again, so significant in the tradition. So the critique that Mencius will make of Moists isn't even that it's wrong, which is intriguing, and we'll come back to that. It's not a metaphysical claim that metaphysically the Moists are wrong. He thinks they are wrong, but that's not the heart of the argument, because, as we'll see, he takes it for granted that our metaphysical claims are not going to be judged on whether they're right or wrong, because we have no access to that anyway. Rather, the critique that Mencius will make is, if you assume a foundational vision and try to organize the world accordingly, it will be incredibly limiting in terms of the projects that you can undertake, both for the self and the larger world. So one of his explicit critiques is to say, the Moists will argue in favor of what they will call a vision of radical universal love, in which everyone should love everyone else absolutely equal, regardless of whether it's a stranger, someone you've never met, a family member, a non-family member. It should make no difference. All human beings should be developing a sense of radical love, because that is the love you see in heaven. And the further argument is, you should organize the world according to the degree to which people attain this, because it's difficult to attain. And so you should organize the world according to a basic meritocracy where those who attain this level of universal love move up, and those who fail to do so don't, to sort of encourage that next generation to do the same. So you see here a notion of meritocracy that will become very important in the Chinese tradition, but here explicitly worked out in terms of a foundational notion of a higher deity giving us a foundational vision of ethics that should be organizing, or that's providing us the guideline for our reorganization of the world. To which Mencius responds tellingly, the problem with this in practice is that if, going back to a theme that's so important in the Confucian tradition, one of our dangers as human beings is our tendency to fall into these patterns and ruts that will define the very way we see the world, our actions, how we build relationships, that even though this vision of universal love sounds like a great way to break from those, Mencius argues, in practice, it's going to create the exact opposite. Because what you'll do is you'll create a world in which everyone, in order to seek advancement, will do what they need to do in this clearly given foundational ethics of what is right and what is wrong. They therefore will quickly learn from a very young age, if I do X that's defined as foundationally right, I get rewarded. If I do Y, which is defined foundationally as what is wrong, I will get punished. Very quickly they will learn, do what's right. quickly start getting rewarded. And very quickly you create a world not based upon universal love. You create a world of self-interested, narcissistic individuals simply seeking their own immediate interest. You create a perfect marketplace of perfectly self-interested, narcissistic people. Out of the claim of a radical shift, a radical new world of universal love, you create the precise opposite. And as Ben makes the larger point, which is to say, this is going to be true of any utopic vision. Any attempt to build a utopia based upon a foundational vision will always fail, regardless of what the foundation is. It doesn't matter what the foundation is. Not to say there aren't some better foundations than others. It's to say any foundational claim in which you try to organize all human experience, all of our social worlds, all of our political activities, all of our ethical visions, according to that one notion, as soon as you do that, you will simply create people channeled according to, since this is we're humans, these perfect patterns, these perfect ruts that will then define your very existence. And that will, in the long run, mean a destruction of what we are otherwise capable of becoming. In other words, putting it in strong terms, he's not even really saying the Mohists are metaphysically wrong. What he's really saying is, don't do foundational metaphysics. Don't do foundational ethics. Don't create isms. It's a radical rejection of the entire vision. Now, if that's the case, it immediately raises the question that we're posing to Western tradition. If, assuming it is, and I think we will see it is, it's a powerful philosophical tradition, then what is the driving tension, right? If Mencius, in a sense, kind of wins the day, in the sense that minus these very powerful millenarian traditions, most of the philosophical tradition ultimately accepts the Mencian critique that foundational ethics with isms based upon claims of foundations is a dangerous approach. What, in a sense, becomes the driving tension that makes the tradition so powerful? And what I would argue is, in a sense, the Chinese tradition takes as its opening ground of being the very work that, in a sense, kind of the Western tradition is creating as the problem. and that's an absurdly abstract way of putting it. So let me now get on the contrary, extremely concrete in terms of what I mean. The argument is, assume the world is what our experience shows it to be. Assume that the world, on the contrary, actually is a world of incredible flux in which absolutely nothing is stable, in which there is no clearly knowable foundational truth. Now, again, note the intriguing thing. Mencius doesn't say there isn't a foundational truth. He just says, we don't know it. So maybe there is. Maybe there is a good heaven up there, but who knows? So there's no clear foundational truth, no clear foundational metaphysical assumptions that we can follow, no clear foundational ethical vision that we can follow, no universalizable ethics that would be anything other than creating us into certain ruts and patterns that in the long run would be incredibly dangerous. You take that as your opening claim, and then your second claim is the degree to which we don't experience the world that way. In other words, the degree to which we see something as being stable. In other words, the degrees to which we become Mohists is the degree to which we're fooling ourselves. And that's the danger. And so your concern is you're always trying to prevent any kind of a claim that there is something foundational that we can follow, that there is one unifying utopian vision that we can follow, that there's some kind of foundational metaphysics that we can follow, there's some kind of foundational ethics that we can follow. Your push is against that. And you see this animates the tradition constantly. So people are always accusing others, ooh, you're becoming a little too moist. In other words, you're falling into making foundational claims. And if that's the case, then of course it only heightens the question we were posing earlier, which is, well then what in the world do you do, and why does this prove, as I would argue it does, productive, and every bit as productive as the Western tradition, but in a very different way that we need to explore. And I think the reason it proves so productive is the following. Because if you take this as your opening move, then the fact, and they absolutely take it as a fact, that this world of our experience is every bit as miserable as the world that the Western philosophers are describing as the world of their experience. But again, they want to cut out the possibility of making a foundational rejection of it that will then guide the reorganization of it. And kind of the thrust or the central tension of the Chinese tradition then is, how do you make that break minus a foundational claim? In other words, to put it in strong terms, if you assume the world that we see around us as being inadequate, which it obviously is, they said that is an empirical fact, a world where horrible things happen, horrible tragedies befall us constantly, and regardless, we all die, and when we die, our human projects fall to naught, and moreover, to up the ante, our worst tendency is to fall into these ruts that will so define us, we cease to even see the world around us, let's build a better world. If this is the human condition, and you are going to deny any claim, yet the argument is we always want to claim it, but you're not allowed to, any kind of a foundational basis, whether it's located above or within, as the means of reorganizing it, then the move is you start developing everything from philosophical techniques to socio-political institutions explicitly, and most importantly, sort of bridging the two, an educational curriculum designed to constantly be breaking us from these tendencies to fall into certain ways of experiencing the world with, again, the kind of push, to use that word we were using last week, with a push toward a claim that what you're really trying to do is develop a world where you cease to see the world from limited perspectives, perfect ruts, where your goal, the kind of push, is, again, a world of resonance in which you are seeing the complexity of the world around you, the messiness of the world, and you're trying to actually build a better world within very minimal definitions of better meaning, actually relating to each other in ways that will allow everything to flourish. Which, again, is an absurdly, absurdly contentless-based way of putting it, and yet that's the key. Because if you're not allowed a foundational claim, that's what you need to do. And this becomes the push, which, as I mentioned last week, has led, I think, in the 20th century, a lot of Western philosophers to misread Chinese philosophy when they first encountered it by saying, for example, oh, when the Confucians talk about rituals, that's because they want us to become the ritual creatures that the ritual tells us to become. And as we saw, actually, no, it doesn't work that way. The whole point of the rituals is not you should be socialized into being the person in the ritual. The whole point of the rituals is it socializes you into being a different person than what you normally are. And then the goal of that is reaching toward this different sense of humaneness, benevolence, pushing you against your normal ways of interacting, of seeing the world. Same thing much later when you get a very strong metaphysical push in the tradition. So a lot of people have read, Western philosophers, I should say, have read the Chinese tradition saying, well, later when you get the emergence of Neo-Confucianism, you get this strong metaphysical view, very much in contrast to what you see before, where you get these grand claims of what the cosmos really is. Actually, no. Think of that cosmology as operating very much like the rituals are operating for Confucius. It's counterintuitive to the world we currently experience. And if the cosmology is helpful, it's helpful in the sense that the rituals are helpful. It breaks us from our normal ways of assuming the world. That's why it matters. To give you an earlier example that will be very influential on this, if you read the early text of Zhuangzi, the entire text of the Zhuangzi is kind of a cosmological rereading of a ritual. And so if in a ritual, you enter a ritual and you become a different person, interacting with those around you in a different way, forcing a break in your usual forms of interaction and your usual perspectives, the text of the Zhuangzi works the same way with everything. And so you read the Zhuangzi and you become, as you read it, a figure who is, you become a bird, you become a worm, you become a piece of bark. You become this person, that person. And the idea is you are forced to take the perspective of a radically different being, some human, but many, many, many not even human, to break you from your usual perspectives. And the claim isn't, when you're reading this text, that is the real world. Like, this is the real cosmology. It works, if it works, and the tradition feels like you agree with it, it does. When you read it, it works because it breaks you from your usual perspectives, opens up other possibilities, and then the key is, it's what happens after that. Just as with rituals, it's what happens after the ritual, if it's really working. Neo-Confucian metaphysics, I would say, operates along the same principles. It's not saying, here is metaphysically the way the world really operates, contrary to our experience. It's rather saying, we're going to give you a metaphysics that absolutely is contrary to our experience, because if it works, it will force you to see the world differently. And tellingly, but you can almost predict it, the key of that cosmology is it's being developed as sort of these metaphysical claims, but again, it's not quite an accurate term as you're seeing, is that's a world of radical flux. Radical flux. It's not a world of pure being, pure stability, a realm of ideas outside the realm of experience. The move is to say, think of the world as one of such radical flux that we are overly experiencing the world as being stable when it's not. We overly perceive ourselves and the world around us to be stable. It's not. And again, the claim isn't, here's the real cosmology that you can say, build a science on. It's, here's a cosmology that works like a ritual. Enter this cosmology, and when you come out, you won't see the world as being as stable as you did before you read this text. That's what it does. It's like the Zhuangzi. If it works because it breaks you from your usual ways of thinking. Let me now pull back and make the larger point. I think in the tradition of China, you see every bit as much as in the West, and I would think it's really the same concern, an attempt to build a tension with the world of our experience. In both cases, a radically strong sense that the world that we are born into is lesser than it could be. We, as humans, are lesser than we could be. And we live in a world that needs to be altered and changed. And we, as human beings in particular, need to alter and change ourselves in the worlds we are creating for ourselves. But what you see becoming kind of the dominant traditions ends up going in a very different direction. In the case of the West, a strong foundational vision is building that tension, again, located without or located within, but that's where you get the tension. And note consistently, that foundational vision tends to be one of stability. It's one of being, as opposed to the world of our experience. In China, incredibly similar concern, but yet the concern then isn't to say, let us find some foundational basis for our activities. Let us, on the contrary, do everything we can to break any move toward a foundation. Again, in senses we always tend to fall into it, but don't. And then you try to build that tension by creating these, and I'll call them constructs. Maybe they ritual, metaphysical kind of in scare quotes, as you can now see, but constructs that will force us to break out of this, to open up other possibilities. In other words, I would say a very similar tension, but playing out in radically different ways. In fact, to some extent, what each sees as the solution, the other sees as the problem. Even though the ultimate problem is very similar, the tension is very similar, but the solution goes in radically different ways. If this is the case, then let's get to the crux of the matter. What do we learn? Why would this be helpful? In other words, if we are now, luckily for us, I would argue, living in a time when we can do comparative philosophy, in other words, where we have access to different philosophical traditions that we can then see, over now thousands of years, the implications of wrestling with tensions one way as opposed to a different way, what do we learn from the exercise? And again, I'll make some grand generalizations, and feel free both to mention exceptions as well as give counter generalizations, but just to lay a few things out on the table. One of the ones I'd like to focus on immediately, because we are in a tradition that I think is largely an inheritor of the kind of foundational vision that has been so dominant in the Western tradition. One immediate challenge I think we get if we really try to wrestle with Chinese philosophy is it forces us to ask the question, what if we're wrong at two levels? What if we're wrong, most obviously, in seeking some kind of a foundational basis for our actions? What if, on the contrary, there is something dangerous? In other words, like the Moist vision, trying to build a perfect utopia, it's not just that you don't quite get to the utopia, which again, most people would admit, it's that you can create horrible kind of counter versions of the world by the very attempt to do so. And the fact that the grand revolutionary projects of the 19th and 20th centuries, from this perspective, have ended so disastrously isn't because, sadly, Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union at a certain moment. It's because there's an inherent danger in that very attempt to try to undergo radical change through some kind of a foundational vision. That is an inherently dangerous position. And looking more immediately to our concerns, since for better and for worse, those revolutionary impulses, as I mentioned, have kind of died out in the current form that's become commonsensical. Here, I think one of the key challenges for us is to say, what if our precious notion of the unified true self is, again, not simply foundationally wrong, which isn't the key, but rather Dimensian critique, it's inherently dangerous. That it is inherently dangerous that the very thing we love is sort of the basis for changing ourselves, we think, for the better, and judging those around us, is an inherently dangerous vision, because it only means we create the very kind of self-interested, narcissistic individuals that presumably many of our ethics are aiming at rejecting. And in fact, it's in practice simply producing that, and inherently producing it, because our basis of critique only makes it all the worse by always returning to that vision of some inherent true self. What if that is incredibly dangerous? And then what if, on the contrary, we tried to say, okay, what if we take as sort of the ground of our being, that it is a messy world, that we are messy selves, that there is no foundation that could be guiding us, and what if we actually began taking seriously what that would mean? Now, we obviously can't simply return to doing rituals as they were done, practiced by Confucius, or metaphysics as being practiced by the Neo-Confucians, or I think they advocate them, because again, those would only work the degree to which they forced breaks that, by definition, now would not. So how would we do the equivalent of that? And here, it seems to me, is precisely the place where comparative philosophy can be so incredibly powerful. Because any time you see, and I've just given one of the countless examples that I think we've experienced as we continue to do this, any time you see one position that becomes so accepted that it starts creating these very dangerous, and obviously here I'm buying much more than the Chinese tradition when I put it this way, very dangerous assumptions of stability. Your goal is you intentionally begin working with other philosophical ideas to try to break that down. And in essence, what you're doing is you are, in a sense, accepting the position that, yes, the world is messy. But no, that doesn't mean you're accepting the Chinese tradition over the Western tradition. In a sense, what you're doing is to say the modern version of even the Western tradition, which is so often put in terms of a nihilistic position. There was a God, and God is dead. We used to believe in a foundational truth, and now we can't believe anymore, and therefore we have to turn to the self. You're in a sense saying, instead of that sense of there's some radical loss because there's no ultimate beings, we must turn to the being within, rather what you're saying, there's no stability all the way down, and kind of your opening assumption is what in the 19th century is seen as this horrible sense of nihilism. Rather, in the Chinese tradition, you say, your opening assumption is, or opening experience in the world, is one where there is no foundational meaning, and then all of the work comes from that. In other words, in a sense, what you're doing is saying you take the modern version of Western philosophy, but you take out those last little pieces of claims of foundation, and once you begin seriously doing that, suddenly the power of other traditions that have been wrestling with that very concern come all the more to the fore. And then, of course, it raises the very question that Roberto raised. Last week, we were discussing Confucianism, which in a comparative context is exactly the right question to ask, which is to say, and are there moments when you need strong foundational claims to make more of a break than you're getting through whatever kinds of constructs we're utilizing? The answer, again, at times may absolutely be yes, which would mean, again, a stronger push toward the revolutionary projects that things like the Confucian tradition are so skeptical about. And yet, by definition, if you're doing it this way, you immediately build in the necessary skepticism of any such revolutionary project, where from day one you realize, okay, we're going to make this attempt to build a radically different world, knowing every step of the way we are very likely, that guaranteed, to be falling into something incredibly dangerous. And so you're building in from the beginning some kind of a self-critique of the very project you're undertaking. In short, what I'd like to suggest is the following. I think the tensions animating the traditions, in this case the Western and Chinese tradition, are actually comparable. The solutions very different, each with strengths and absolutely each with dangers. And if the opening tensions are comparable enough, and I think they are, to allow us to learn from the other, then what would it mean to truly actually pose the question? I don't mean to imply this is an easy question, or an easy question to answer, but to truly pose the question of what would it mean to build revolutionary utopian projects, again, part of what has been so powerful in the Western tradition over the past 2 centuries, while building in the kind of intense skepticism that you see in Amenchus of precisely those projects, and how can you bring those together? In other words, how do you bring in that self-critique such that it's very inherent in the revolutionary project, but not in a way, of course, that's paralyzing? We want to change the world, and yet, can you build into that revolutionary project the kind of self-critique that would allow you to say, we're building a construct that by definition, like any construct, will have its dangers, and we need to build in a critique. I think that is not something that the great revolutionary traditions of the 19th and 20th centuries emerging from the West have been very good at, to put it very bluntly. And what would it mean were we to take the Chinese tradition seriously to do so, while again, at least from my perspective, avoiding such an over-skepticism that would lead us to turn away from and not undertake the revolutionary projects. It's just one example among many, and yet I would like to conclude by simply pointing out it's a crucial one. I mean, if we are living in a world, and I think obviously we are, by the way, I'm using this tone of voice and posing the question, in which one of our dangers for the past several decades is we have thought we were living in an end of history position where we kind of had one vision, namely neoliberalism, as being sort of de facto the only acceptable position. As Margaret Thatcher famously said, it's not that this is a good thing, it's just that there's no other alternative. We have no choice but to be good neoliberals. And if the past few decades we've been kind of unhappy neoliberals, in other words, apart from a few people, I don't think too many people have enjoyed the past few decades, but their sense is there's no alternative, right? Like we've tried the grand revolutionary projects, they didn't work, this is the best we can come up with, just live with it. I think the history of the past year has shown that that world is collapsing. If many of us are not happy with what is coming up in its place, these authoritarian right-wing movements, which hardly seem good alternatives, what would it mean to actually honestly have alternatives, but honestly have alternatives that wouldn't fall into the danger of coming up with yet another ism? Like, okay, communism didn't work, socialism didn't work, neoliberalism didn't work, what's our next ism? Could we actually, on the contrary, develop radical projects of change that would not be based upon an ism, that would honestly take seriously the fact that the world is inherently messy, our projects are always going to lead to incredible dangers, and yet we must undertake them anyway. And I would at least like to humbly suggest, I think the Chinese tradition gives us both the powers and dangers of wrestling with that issue, and if connected with the revolutionary projects of the Western tradition, could provide a possible way forward as we begin to build a self-critical attempt to finally create an alternative to neoliberalism. Just one thought among many, and let's open this up for discussion. Great.
Cornell, do you want to say something first?
Do you want to jump in? I
Yeah.
can jump in anytime.
So I do have some questions for Michael, but I don't know whether you'd like.
Well, let's look at it this way,
Yes.
very briefly. That another magnificent lecture. That what does it mean to have a comic sensibility with a radical politics?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what is distinctive about the Chinese and the West, the very notion of a comic philosopher is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Now, why is that so?
Exactly.
From Aristophanes to Lucian
Yes.
to Swift to Joyce
Yes.
to Twain to the blues. The blues is profoundly tragic comic. Why? Because philosophers predicate their project on logos, on rationality, to make sure consistency, coherence, and transparency is the result. A comic philosopher begins with the mess, begins with the funk. Which is what? Inconsistency, incoherence, incongruity. How do you come to terms with the contradictions that are shot through the unified self and still have a commitment to transform self and transform society, what we're calling loosely radical politics?
Yes.
Now, why is it that the comic sensibility rarely has access to the philosophic terrain in China or in the West?
Yes.
Now, what's fascinating about a comic sensibility is, and this is what Brother Roberto and I find it out, and you've highlighted this, is that it does not lean toward the future or futurity as this site of alternatives, as if the tradition or history doesn't also provide grand examples. Because the comic flattens things out. Read Montaigne, read Chekhov and Beckett and Kafka. They're comic artists, highly suspicious of the philosophers. What does Chekhov say in his journals? To hell with the philosophers. They are as despotic as generals. They just want to enlist you in their army. He says, I don't want to be in an army. I want to be a free man. He sounds like a blues man. I don't want to be a free man. I can pull from a variety of different schools of thought. I can pull from a variety of different ways of looking at the world. All of them shot through with their own particular kinds of inconsistencies. And I'm going to add my own inconsistencies before the worms get me. Now, looked at in that way, I see what you said today is very, very similar without that talk about the comic. Is that a fair characterization?
Very fair. I think that's beautifully put.
Now, what would be the difference between you and I at this point, you think?
I'm still agreeing.
No, because I mean,
please go ahead.
because the thing about
Yes.
Confucius is what? Failure is built in.
Absolutely.
If you're looking for some grand project and it doesn't work, you're sentimental, and the flip side of sentimentalism is cynicism. You end up a spectatorial cynic. Spectator looking, rather than still intervening and yet knowing it's going to be incoherent and inconsistent and so forth. Now, if that is the case, then the question becomes, why is it that this what we're talking about, what I'm talking about, is so underdeveloped?
Yes.
But Cornell, there's a second aspect to the comic
Yes.
sensibility.
Yes.
You've highlighted one aspect, which is the rejection of the idea of a definitive integration.
Yes.
But there's another aspect which distinguishes the comic from the tragic, and that's the emphasis on resolution, on the possibility of the resolution of contradictions.
Right.
So that's the progressive and transformative aspect of the comic sensibility, and that's why we might think that comedy is more profound than tragedy, because it doesn't take given oppositions as forever. They have this temporal character and they're subject to resolution.
But I would want to draw a radical distinction between the comic as you have defined it and the tragic comic in late modernity. The tragic comic is not about resolution. Beckett is not about resolution. Kafka is not about, Chekhov's not about resolution.
Yes.
What the blues, certainly no resolutions at all. It's only about moral and spiritual fortitude. Are you equipped to deal with the funk? to deal with the mess, to deal with the pain, to deal with the agony, to deal with the anguish, period, before the worms get you. Now that actually has an intimate relation to democratic modes of being in the world. Because democracy is about the mess always already there and the attempt to convince human beings to cultivate the capacity to think critically, to have empathy, and to think that you can sustain something so fragile and nearly almost absurd as a democratic experiment given the history of the species that's shot through with domination, exploitation, hate, and resentment. And we see every attempt of the grand revolutionary projects. What do we see? Reproduction of new domination. Here come the American revolutionaries. They are so revolutionary. Indigenous peoples, genocide. Africans, enslavement. White working men with no property, exploitation. Women, subjugation. And yet they're talking about freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can go on and on and on. We see it in Africa. Unbelievable, heroic, anti-colonial struggles. Here comes neoliberal, post-colonial elites reproducing domination. Straights, we can go on and on. Straights talking about their grand vision and then treating trans and gays and lesbians like they're cockroaches. I mean, over and over again. And that can be depressing. What's interesting about the tragic comic is but the tragic comic trumps depression.
Yeah, yeah.
Even as you wrestle with despair. You're supposed to wrestle with despair. It's a world worthy of you being in despair. That's a sign of sensitivity. Anybody not wrestling with despair needs to wake up. The problem is that when you do wake up and you see how bad things are, you can escape or go back to sleep quickly. And at that point, it's a matter of the fortitude that you have to keep fighting, even if your chances of a grand project is that of a snowball in hell. That's what the West is unsettled with. So you see the difference, the tragic comic. Will you accept that distinction, oh, Brother Roberto? The tragic comic versus the comic?
Yes, but again, one can make a further distinction between the idea that there's a definitive resolution,
Yes, yeah.
as in Hegel, for example,
Right.
and the idea that there are resolutions. So
Resolution small r versus resolution
So it's one
capital
thing
R.
to say that every form of advance is flawed
Yes.
and full of evil and so forth. And it's another thing to say there's no form of advance, there's no resolution,
Absolutely.
which is then a conservative mystification of reality.
Absolutely.
A denial of transformative opportunity.
And you're never denying progress. I mean, you remember Chekhov writes in his journal, he says, of course, I don't believe in progress, capital P, but when I was a young person, I got beat up every day. And when I became an adult, I didn't get beat up. That's progress. It's not a metaphysical progress. It's not the inevitability of things getting better. You're just not getting beat up every day anymore. Very concrete. Very concrete. Chekhov was on. Am I right, though, brother? we disagree a little bit. He understands. We got the Russian brother in the house. Well, Russian don't have a monopoly on Chekhov, but this one does. He got deep understanding. But that's the point. You see, patriarchy in place. Can't even go to a ruling class place like Harvard. Now the women can come, they 50%. Does patriarchy still operate? Hell yes. It's just a new form. That's still progress. Small p. Long way to go. Working class women, poor women, catching hell, so forth and so on. So how then do you keep track of these registers committed to a radical politics, but with a comic sensibility saying, let's just tell the truth. This really is a mess. And yet we re-engage over and over again.
So, and this has a political expression.
Yes.
Going back to Michael's reference to the isms.
Mm-hmm.
So, in our political thinking, in our thinking about society, we find ourselves in a situation without historical precedent, which is that we have reason to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives alternative ways of organizing politics and the economy.
Is your microphone
But-
on, though?
Yes. Alternative ways to organize politics and the economy. As the 19th century liberals and socialists did. But we can no longer bring ourselves to believe in definitive institutional blueprints. So we need somehow to find and to formulate structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. And that is a circumstance without precedent in history. And it does take as one of its premises the belief in the possibility of transformation. But it wants to dissociate transformation from the idea of the final structure of the definitive blueprint. And that's something that we could take away from this comparative conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, Michael, no one knows how to do comparative philosophy.
Indeed.
But he just did it. He just did it.
So I want to ask you three sets of questions of increasing difficulty.
Thank God it's not a fourth. Yes. Only three.
Only three, that's all right.
Just in order to provoke further your reflections
Absolutely.
about comparative philosophy and what we can learn from it.
Yeah.
So the first question is this. It's a very simple question.
Really?
I think it was three answers to those three questions.
We have these different philosophical traditions.
Yes.
In the tradition of Western philosophy, there's a dominant view. One of its elements is this Greek philosophy of being. There's an abiding structure of the world and of regularities governing the structure outside of time. And there is a recessive tradition of speculative monism, as in Schopenhauer or Spinoza, that asserts that all these distinctions in the world are epiphenomenal or shallow, and everything is everything else, and time is ultimately illusory. In India, in the philosophies of ancient India, what is recessive in the West is dominant. And what is dominant in the West is recessive.
Absolutely.
Then we have this third philosophical tradition that you've spoken about, China, which is in turn starkly different from the other two. Although, as you observed, every major position in the history of Western philosophy has some counterpart in China, but the arrangement is completely different, and the character of the dominant tendency.
Yeah.
Now, here's the problem that I want you to speak about first. It can't be that the character of human experience in these different parts of the world is as different as the dominant ideas are. So there are these different philosophical traditions that are reflections on human experience and its possibilities, and they're much more different from one another than the actual experience of people in these parts of the world could be. Now, this is a disturbing fact, and because it's as if we were in the hands of the dead. So we grow up in one of these parts of the world, and there seems to be this enormous influence of path dependency. You think in a certain world because you happen to have been born in China or in India or in Europe. It's like this scandal of faith that we discussed with respect to religion. You believe a certain thing because your parents believed it. Now, what are we to make of this? It would seem that philosophy is supposed to be, among other things, a rebellion of the living against the dead. The point of education is to transcend these accidents of path dependency. And yet it seems that on the record of comparative philosophy, as you've just described it, for the most part that doesn't happen. So what should our attitude be to this simple fact? I mean, you could say that one purpose of comparative philosophy would be to change that and somehow to equalize the scales so that we would be less in the hands of the dead. I'd like to see you speak to that.
Absolutely. No, wonderful question. And beginning with one piece of Chinese philosophy to underline your point, yes, one of the key themes we've seen in Chinese philosophy is we as humans are unbelievably path-dependent to degrees to which we really do not see, and that are incredibly frightening when one looks at the arc of both the human life and, getting to the heart of your question, Roberto, the arc of the civilization. Incredibly so. Which means, getting back to the heart of your point, yes, I think one of the things you get looking back on the roughly 2,500 years of these philosophical traditions from the Axial Age is the chilling degree to which you see very comparable sets of issues popping up across Eurasia, 6 through about the 4 centuries BCE, with certain of those positions taking off, other positions becoming recessive, and then that continues. with all the grand changes that occur, you can still, I think, make these grand generalizations because of the path dependency. I mean, you really see recurrent dominant positions being articulated, debated, altered, and yet they continue to be dominant. The recessive ones continue to be recessive, and we're path-dependent creatures. And the very fact that, as you said, philosophy, as we're using the term, not an academic philosophy, but sort of philosophy, as we're using the term, these kind of grand philosophico-religious movements of the Axial Age, again, the philosophers are really more like prophets in many ways. If sort of one of the few things that all of them shared was a radical desire to break from the path dependency that had dominated Eurasia for the previous 2,000 years during the Bronze Age, it's kind of chilling about the degree to which we continue to be very path-dependent creatures, and those philosophical traditions became path-dependent themselves. But getting back to the heart of the question, though,
we can diminish path.
Yes, and what I find
we
powerful,
do that in politics
yes,
and in the economy,
absolutely,
creating structures that facilitate their own
yes,
decision. And we could do that in thought as well.
Exactly, and this I think is the key for comparative philosophy. Because I think what we can do, because I agree, we're in a unique position to be able to do this, is we actually can now see, over the course of these 2,500 years, that pieces of the tradition that have been very incredibly effective at breaking these path dependencies, the reasons when they fail and become rigidified again, and if you're then actually trying to learn from that history, then you begin, I think you're right, to develop ever better ways of breaking that path dependency, a concern I think that both these traditions share.
You see how Brother Roberto formulated this thing.
Exactly. The living and the dead. I was about to get there, but you'll do it much more eloquently.
Brother Roberto, he's so new world. The new world's in love with futurity. It's in love with the future. So the living rebel against the dead.
Yes.
No, the dead also rebels against the living.
Yes.
You see? Martin Luther King Jr. been dead almost 50 years. Yeah. His voice from the grave is a rebellion against what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Not just here in Hungary and all around the Middle East, across the board. Shakespeare, Virginia Woolf. Their voices rebel against the present. They rebel against the living. The conception of the dead must not be characterized as somehow they're always either pro-status quo or reinforcing the worst. Some of the most important voices, the Dorothy Days and Rabbi Heschels and Edward Said, they're dead. They're in the vanguard of the critique of the present because most of the living is too conformist or cowardly to raise their voices the way they did. That's why we don't have no Martin Kings or Edward Saids for the most part because they're too conformist, they're too careerist. So in that sense, the dialectical interplay between the past and the present. You going to revise that a little bit for me?
I'll propose a compromise. Although it's against my nature.
I think the first time ever you were here.
You may have reason to reject.
Right?
So, memory informs processing.
Yes.
Prophecy is higher than memory.
Don't accept it. No.
No, but I I like the poetry of it. I like the poetry of it. No, I think it's true. But you agree that some of the great prophetic voices could be in the past. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let me go on to my second question.
Just literally 2 sentence response to these points. Yes, so I think one of the very places you see where you can learn from comparative philosophy in terms of path dependency is it helps us see the dangers of the self-proclaimed Western modernity position that everything that came before should be called traditional. It's the world of the dead. We're moving beyond it. And I think it's important to learn, one of the key things one learns from the Chinese tradition is, on the contrary, it's actually those dead who can actually give us the most radical visions that will most fully break our assumptions. It's not just those of our self-proclaimed modern world that, in fact, the distant past can offer some of the most significant and searing critiques.
So here's the second question. You, in your account of Western and Chinese philosophy, emphasize the contrast between a philosophy of being and a philosophy of becoming. And I want to come back to that in my third question. But there's another distinction, which is different from that one, although related to it. And that's the distinction between, to use categories of Max Weber's, between the this-worldly and the other-worldly, between the extent to which a way of thinking is encased within immediate experience and perception, or destabilizes it and seeks to escape the gravitational field of our immediate experience. Now, especially when viewed from the perspective of Chinese philosophy and its predominant tendencies, the most striking characteristic of the dominant tendencies in Western philosophy is this attempt to escape from the world of immediate experience and perception. And it seems that there have been three great forces that have influenced this destabilization in the history of Western philosophy. The first force has been the reckoning with Christianity, or more generally with the Semitic monotheists, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Because these are views that present a conception of ultimate reality that is in radical tension with what seems to be the case with our immediate experience. There's an eruption of the divine in human history that shakes everything up and casts a different light on our experience. And Western philosophy has taken a position with that, with respect to that, either attempting to give a philosophical rendition of faith, or of opposing it, but then in opposing it, as in some form of atheism, usually being equally radical in its destabilization of the experience. Now, the second force of destabilization has been the connection with science. Because the tradition of modern science, from Newton and Galileo to today, also presents a view of the world in radical contradiction with our experience. That the world is not what it seems to be. And this has been a great force in the evolution of philosophy, and it was already prefigured in classical philosophy, because Aristotle, the most influential ancient philosopher in the development of Western philosophy, investigated the structure of the world. He too was a scientist with a biological rather than a physical imagination, and all of his conceptions are informed by this ambitious scientific project. The third great destabilizing force has been the confrontation with what here I call these ineradicable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. So the dominant attitude in Western philosophy has been that philosophy is in a constant struggle with nihilism. It goes up to the edge of the cliff, of the precipice, of confrontation with mortality, groundlessness, and insatiability. And it needs this confrontation for us to awake from our slumber, from our routines, from our conformity, And it's as if the whole spirit of nihilism were incorporated into the internal spirit of philosophy, of Western philosophy. So these three forces operating together produce a fire. They account for the incendiary character of Western philosophy with regard to our ordinary experience. By contrast, it seems that the dominant tendency in the history of Chinese philosophy has been intransitantly this worldly, despite the existence of these metaphysical tendencies, such as Mohism and Taoism. And there have been two main registers in the history of Chinese philosophy, crudely put. One, as in the classical teaching of Confucius and Mencius themselves, the focus on human experience. In a meaningless cosmos, we create meaning. We ground ourselves collectively. Without this destabilization of the internal human world. And the second register, as in Neo-Confucianist metaphysics, has been then to try to produce a cosmological envelope or framework for these views. But one feels that most of what's done under that label has the character of just so stories. So it's as if you said, well, there are 15 elements and 6 forces, but why not 16 forces and 3 elements? It has an arbitrary character, as if it were not for real. And it's not connected to elements that would ground it, such as the relation of Western philosophy to Western positive science. So I'd like you to say something about that. Is that correct? The view that there is such a contrast, and what are we to make of that? Because it's as if the understanding of what philosophy is for was fundamentally different. In one case, it's this internal development of the human world on its own terms, with criticism and transformation, but from inside. And in the other case, it's to put it on fire and to escape as in a rocket from this world of immediate experience to some other field.
I actually don't fully agree, so let me be past it. And let me begin with a grand generalization. So I would actually say one of the few, and it's one of the few, but I do think it is a key one of the few things shared by all of the great philosophical and religious movements of the Acid Age is all of them want to break from the current world they were living in. All of them thought the world of our experience, the world that we had taken for it to be natural, should be radically destroyed. All of them, in very, very different ways, were incredibly strongly emphasizing how do we force that break? How do we wake people up? To use a term that pops up just literally everyone in these traditions, and over again, how do we wake people up from this world again that they thought to be a natural hierarchical world and break them from this? So I would say that concern underlies all of what we now think of as the great philosophical traditions that all emerged during this crucial moment in Eurasian history. I think they all share that. Now, I agree with you completely. They take it in very different directions, which is why I think it's so fascinating and important to do comparative philosophy. To quickly agree, and therefore I'll be brief on it, with your characterization of the Western tradition, yes, I think the move there is often you find that break by positing something above, beyond, and greater than the current world. So something radically otherworldly, the ideas, God himself, something radically other, radically counterintuitive to our experience to push that break. Absolutely. The place where I would somewhat disagree is your characterization of the Chinese tradition. Now, let me immediately say, not so much in the characterization of is this worldly. I think that's accurate. It's in some of the words you seem to be implying that this worldliness means accepting the world of our experience. And that's where I think we disagree. I would say all of the traditions, Mohism, Confucianism, Taoism, all of the traditions, they are absolutely committed to saying, in fact, it's their sort of opening concern, the world of our experience needs to be broken. It is absolutely true, as you said, most, and most are exception, but it is an exception, therefore a telling one. Most of what become the dominant traditions don't do that by positing something radically other. It's rather exactly as you said, it's to say, convince that the world they exist in does not have a foundation.
So it's
There's
as,
nothing natural.
it's as if the Archimedean lever came from inside human experience, rather than from these forces that are outside.
Yeah, I mean, yes, although again, we need to be careful, not necessarily with what you're saying, but just so it's not incorrectly, that as long as we understand that the inside means a real break, I mean, the idea of when Zhuangzi writes this text to force a break, you're right, he's not positing a transcendental realm beyond, but it's doing the same function as a transcendental realm, but trying to do it within this world. I mean, it's trying to force a break from the world that we accept as natural, saying it is not natural, and that we have created this, we assume this to be some kind of natural way of being, and it's not. It's a human construct and a bad one, and the goal is to break it. And again, I would say, jumping in with one we hadn't discussed nearly as much today, but we discussed briefly 2 weeks ago, equally true in the South Asian tradition. Buddhism too is absolutely out to break us from our most fundamental assumptions.
But there
So I
is,
think they all share this.
but there is an assumption, and we're going to open it up.
Oh yes, absolutely.
But one last point, there is an assumption, though, I think, that's operative in part in Brother Roberto's formulation about the West itself. I'm not convinced that the Western philosophical tradition has been fully truthful about its will to truth. And what I mean by that is all the fire that it produces still presupposes a certain ice that it doesn't want to melt. There's a wonderful moment in Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, you remember, where he says slavery was a presupposition for centuries, as was patriarchal also. Even Jesus himself was not an abolitionist. He looked around and saw slavery. He was not an abolitionist. There are certain ice that the Western philosophical tradition does not want to melt for the most part. In the United States, there's 2,000 abolitionists in a nation of millions. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe and others. The slaves want to be free, but I'm talking about outside. So that when we talk about all this fire, that the fire is highly circumscribed and contained. And it's not a matter of extension, where we got fire for the white males. It's coming, Negroes. Just wait for about 400 years and you'll see the fire finally get to your neighborhood. The freedom will finally come to your porch. No, we can't have an extension view of that either. Fire itself is also predicated on certain ice. And if that's the case, then the question becomes, what goes into a tradition that valorizes veritas that don't want to be veritas about itself sometimes? That's a crucial question.
Yes.
Because chickens come home to roost. That's Malcolm and Martin and Fanny and stuff, right? And when the chickens come home to roost, all that Promethean fire that was unleashed is still tied to that eagle that's biting that joke in entrails. You see. And at that point, what do? Impasse. At that point, what do? Either give up or you do precisely what Professor Unger wants to do is, how do you keep alive the fire but also be honest and candid about not just the challenges but the past? And that's why we continue to push it in regard to the past and tradition. But I know we got to open it up because we only got 20 minutes. Question?
Yeah. So earlier in our discussion, it seemed like we were using a lot of language kind of associated with theater, right? The comic, the tragic,
Right.
And citing playwrights. And I wonder if that is in any way kind of tied to these notions of an illusory reality or an illusory self. And I mean, even the blues, right? The blues are a kind of performance, right? They are always performance. Right. And so I just wonder if you could maybe riff for a moment on that relationship between maybe performance and the illusion of reality.
Yeah. Well, one is we can just look at the genealogy. Turn to page 607, B5 in book 10 of Plato's Republic. What does he say? The traditional core between poetry and philosophy. I'm going to generate a form of paideia, a form of education, cultivation of self, and maturation of soul that will displace Homer. So you get a fundamental antagonism, agonistic condition of the philosophers generating dialectic, displacing the poets who generate mythic narratives and stories. And we know Plato began as a tragic writer until he met Socrates. And he's going to make the world save for Socrates every generation. And Socrates does what? Only in prison does Socrates finally recognize that the voice that's been telling him to practice philosophy may have been saying practice the arts. And what does he do? He had never written a word before. He writes a hymn to the gods. He versifies Aesop's fables, which are artistic. It'd be interesting to hear what Socrates' hymn sounded like. It'd be fascinating. Why? Because you got this deep, deep antagonism in the West between so-called performative arts, marginal kind of thing you do in the corner, like when you go to the museum in bourgeois society where artists confined to the peripheral and the real life is making money, buying and selling and so forth and so on. How spiritually empty can you get? So in that sense, the very notion of the performative, as Butler and others have taught us, the very notion of the performative is something to be taken seriously because we know Plato's own attempt to incarnate dramatically the quest for truth, logos, was itself artistic. And all those dialogues are artistic to the bone, even given his deep fear. We were talking before about his banding of the flute in the Republic and only allowing for the lyre to one string. And yet when he died, he got a flute under his pillow. He asked the trashy girl to play. Play-Doh. It's contradictory here. That flute got to you too, didn't it? What is it about that flute, about the poems, about the narratives and stories? What is it about history and herstory, as opposed to philosophical quest through dialectic to the realm of being? Fundamental question. You can imagine it was a larger discussion, but that in the West is a very important site. Very important site. And that's why in the clouds in Aristophanes, what is the characterization of Socrates? It's pretty ugly. Socrates was in the audience watching that play. Yeah. No feet on the ground, head in the clouds. No conception of the thickness in space and time, which makes it very, very difficult to come to terms with what poets presuppose, which is failure, catastrophe, loss, mourning, melancholy, da. That's a beginning. And so, and you're right, I mean, the blues takes you right to the very center of the mess. And it's not just performative, it is the use of body, mind, soul, heart, and tradition to fortify yourself so you don't kill yourself. Or you don't fall into despair, allowed to have the last word. That becomes a very important Gegenstand, very important opposition, not to be called into question. Philosophy has its role. Nothing wrong with the quest for coherence and consistency. But the sign of a mature critical intelligence is the sign of the limits of critical intelligence. See what I mean? So it's not anti-philosophy, it's just circumscribing. The arts have their limits too. They don't change the world, they just find visions and form the fortification. No poet is going to change the world. That would the case. Shelley's revolutionary project would have produced a different Europe. It didn't. He But his words, his spirit, his fire certainly contributed in that regard. We got a number of revolutionary poets like Shelley that we talk about across culture. So Yenka and on and on and on. But that's the beginning of an answer to your question. Did you want to respond to that? Should we go to another?
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Question.
Earlier we were talking about, earlier today in the other class about ritual and really being suspicious of inherited roles and ways of understanding and using ritual to break that up, to decenter your perspective. And then also today we're talking about dependency, path dependency, I think is the term. And I feel like in both, especially with the path dependency conversation, there was an assumption of like some individual either entering this ritual symmetrically with some other individual, any same in society, or some individual choosing from the realm of ideas and somehow just continuing to be dependent for some reason on some others. And I feel like we're not talking about like power. So I'm curious, how does power affect these rituals, and given the stated aims of these rituals, how does that reconcile with a society that still has all these power imbalances? Who gets to prescribe these rituals? Who is being transformed by them? And how do we think of power in terms of the hegemony of certain ideas over, the supposed rigorous tradition of philosophy?
Yeah, wonderful question. And let me just begin with an historical example to underline your point. The try to answer in terms of philosophically what we can learn from it. So I mentioned just in passing these millenarian movements in Chinese history that have been so extraordinarily powerful. Among the many things that has happened right before they emerged is exactly what you're describing. So when you get these ritual traditions that we've been describing, which are all aimed at breaking us from our normal assumptions, and that would include, when they're working effectively, breaking us from our views that the world that currently exists is natural, and therefore the current power relations are somehow natural. One of the things you're explicitly trying to do is break people from that, to make them realize that no, all power relationships are constructs, and therefore should be questioned and critiqued. Tellingly, without, I think, any exception I can think of, when these millenarian movements emerge and erupt, it always comes after a period when, exactly as you mentioned, the state has successfully been able to take control of the rituals. They've been turned into what the Confucians would call not rituals but customs. That distinction we made before, where a custom is, in this way of thinking, simply conventions that teach us the current world is natural. They socialize us into certain assumptions. They get rituals from a Confucian point of view, or the goal of them is to do the exact opposite. So when the state successfully takes control of them, forming these rituals into customs in that sense. So they're forming into things that simply socialize you into accepting current power relations as somehow natural. That's when you get these radical anti-ritual millenarian movements, usually based upon some claim of some higher deity with some deeper foundational truth that will eradicate the world we're currently living in. Very much like the ones we know so well from Western tradition, very comparable. And they pop up within exactly the moments you're mentioning. And so in terms of what philosophically we can learn from this, I think the answer is a strong yes. So these ways of forming, so there are different ways. We'll be looking comparatively different ways of forming breaks from people seeing the world as being what it really is and breaking us from that assumption. When rituals should be brought into the conversation as a powerful way of doing this is when they're effective at creating that break. When, and it's a when, not an if, sadly, a state can effectively utilize them on the contrary to socialize this into a way of being. That's when they become precisely that they need to break from. Absolutely. And I think your way of putting it is beautiful. If anything that socializes into accepting the world we live in as being natural or somehow something that there's no alternative from, that's when you need a break. And then the break is going to come, as we've seen from these different philosophical traditions, in radically different ways, but that's what you need.
Can I just add one quick thing about this issue of operations of power that's very important. Usually when we speak in that way, you're talking about power from above. Now Du Bois talked about the power behind the veil. He talked about the latent power of the relatively powerless. And Thoreau talked about awakening. He called it sleepwalker. He said society is like a train. It proceeds on the back of those who are asleep. When they awake and their latent powers are actualized and realized, the train can no longer go the way it did before. And one reason why Brother Martin was shot and killed and murdered and executed was in bringing together all of these poor people, engaged in his critique of the empire. This Vietnamese baby got the same status as an American baby, and people began to respond. All of a sudden, these powers among the relatively powerless were no longer simply latent, but more and more manifest. And those are powers that have everything to do with mind and education and courage and integrity and fortitude. And all the powers on top can't deal with the sleepwalkers when they awake because the train cannot proceed. It's on their back. It's on their back. And that's very important note to keep in mind, because when you look, for example, at a Clausewitz, the philosopher of war, or Napoleon, one of the grand military, they will say over and over again, my army itself is predicated on something else. It's not just force, power of guns. Right? I've got to make sure that these soldiers are oriented in a certain way, because if once they are no longer oriented, it's just me and my friends getting done in and send me off to walk to the island. That's true for ruling elites on Wall Street. That's true for the White House. See what I mean? That's true for all elites. Kings, queens, monarchs, suzerains, presidents in that capital society, whatever it is. That's true for patriarchs. Professors. All elites. Because if we're radical Democrats, we want accountability. We want answerability. We have our views. We have our perspective. We want to be respected. We want to respect. But this is what it is to be a radical Democrat. That's what Whitman and Emerson were talking about. That's what Brother Martin Van Loo were talking about in the 60s. And that's what the others. So again, when we talk about powers, we never want to adopt a dominant view, which is oftentimes the dominant view at Harvard and so forth. We're only concerned about the operations of power here and what happens up there. No. The operation of this power is also predicated on whether these folks stay asleep and scared and intimidated and uneducated and ignorant and obsessed with just fitting in the status quo rather than changing it. Once these latent powers are recognized, you just watch the powers that be. We saw that at Harvard when I entered in 1970. If it wasn't for the mass rebellion of the 150 cities on fire after Martin was killed, Harvard went from admitting 9 Negroes to 90. And you know, when the intellectual renaissance in the black community, all of a sudden Harvard said, we got all these smart Negroes, we got 10 times more of this in 2 years. Hell no. They were responding to the threats of these folk who are upset because their loved warrior had been shot down like a dog. See what I mean? So in that sense, even the elites who are creative and full of ingenuity, they know how to reproduce themselves in ways that's quite fascinating. Generation after generation, they got to come to terms with those powers from below. And sometimes they crush them. It could be Warsaw rebellions in Poland. You crush the Jewish folk against these gangsters. But they're going to come back. Sometimes it's in the States. You can't crush all of them. You can incarcerate some. You can incorporate some of the middle class. But sooner or later, those latent powers have a way of coming back. And that's very much what radical Democrats keep their eyes on. So you see my point. Powers on both, above, middle, and below. And all levels are fallible. That's why it's never a matter of just speaking truth to power. No. You speak truth to power and you speak your truths to the relatively powerless. And anybody that's obsessed with speaking truth to power is still using the ruling classes and the elites as the fundamental point of reference. They're not the only point of reference. You keep track of them, but they're not the only. You've got some folk here. Once they stretch out, we got a hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Taking your answer from my brother back there about the arts, and in this class we're talking about the conduct of life in West and Eastern civilization. We understand this far in our lives that Africa is a civilization that was predicated on the art. So what do we do then when we talk about Eastern and Western civilization? Not talk about, let me not say South African civilization, say Southern civilization, including our brothers and sisters in Brazil. Where is the conversation there? When will the conversation include civilizations that came, like Timbuktu, for instance?
Yeah. Fundamental question.
Yes.
We need to have a sister sitting right here.
Yes.
To bring to bear precisely the voices of those rich traditions, the way Brother Michael does with the East, and the way I frequently do with the West, and Unger does his thing. Because highbrow humanness, but most of us still suffer from intellectual parochialism.
Yeah.
So we don't understand the indigenous religions. We don't understand the rich tradition. Now we do as scholars, but we have to bring them in because it would be pretentious of us to all of a sudden start speaking on behalf of these rich traditions of indigenous peoples here or in Latin America, especially Africa itself. Of course, we know that there's no Socrates and Plato without Egypt, without Pythagoras, and so forth and so on. But we're not just talking about Egypt. We're talking about the whole continent and all of its richness. And so we stand accused. We are guilty of your powerful critique, but you understand the ways in which certain kind of provincialism is built in. Just the very fact that we're having West-East dialogue is a major move. Our dear brother's on the way to Sweden tonight. Pray for you, brother. Plane in when you get there. But it's having a discussion between the West and the East. You got analytical philosophers on the West side, and then you got Brother Michael and the other talking about the East. You can imagine what kind of discourse it is with analytical philosophy talking about the West. Very smart, but very narrow. Just like law school. sharpen the mind and narrow the mind at the same time. That's what analytic philosophy tends to do. Good luck, brother. Good luck.
And let me just quickly
respond?
no, just a quick point. I agree completely. I mean, yes, I think it's incredibly important to finally bring in China into the conversation, which has been so completely dominated by the West. And yet, absolutely, we need to be aware of the power dynamics that underlie everything we do. And in this case, it's very easy to see them exactly as you're pointing toward. We have the U.S., arguably the dominant power in the world, China, one of the growing powers, very likely to be one of the, if not the dominant powers in the next few decades to come. And so clearly we take the Chinese tradition seriously, as I think we desperately should. But yes, look at what we're leaving out. And how in the world do we bring in those conversations? And what path-dependent ideas are we falling into by looking only at these two, although we have in the Buddhist tradition these three traditions? Are we falling into sets of assumptions about what philosophy should be that we're missing by not looking at other traditions? I would say, of course, yes. And the fact that we're not doing it, I agree. We deserve to be critiqued on it. We desperately need to do so.
So Michael, just to sharpen this idea of the contribution that the study of Chinese philosophy could make to the reconstruction of Western philosophy.
Yes.
To my third question. So in the major tradition of Western philosophy, there have been two characteristic features, which we've discussed before in the course. So one feature is the predominance of this Greek philosophy of being, which is renewed in the tradition of modern science. There's an abiding structure of reality, there are permanent constituents, the laws of nature, the constants and symmetries of nature governing this structure. And they're outside of time.
Yes.
And then there's the other tradition of the speculative monism, everything becomes everything else, time is illusory. What's missing is the third position, that everything is mutable, including change itself, but there's no association of reality with immutability. In other words, everything that's real is temporal, and time goes all the way down. It's that position that would have to be developed.
Absolutely.
Now, then there's a second feature in the history of Western philosophy, especially modern Western philosophy, which is the rule of these successive dualisms. The dualism between the realm of nature and the realm of grace, Descartes' contrast of the things in stuff in space and mental experience, Kant's distinction between the thing in itself and the presuppositions of the human world, and then the modern historicist distinction, the forms of social life as opposed to the study of nature. These dualisms, all of them in a way, convert anthropology into ontology. That is, they reify a view of our experience and then arbitrarily separate them from nature. So it's what Spinoza criticized, the idea of there's a kingdom within the kingdom. But actually in the world there's only one kingdom. So we would need to have a view that overcame this dualism at the same time that it went beyond the Greek philosophy of being. So even on the evidence of what you've said today about the major tradition of Greek philosophy, of Chinese philosophy, it seems that Chinese philosophy is not in the grip of this Greek philosophy of being, and nor is it subordinate to these dualisms. So we could learn something from it.
Absolutely.
In this metaphysical context. But now there's a second side, which is the practical side. And the practical side is the relation of Western philosophy to this unfinished revolutionary project in the world, with its two aspects. It has the political aspect of democracy, liberalism, socialism, and the personalist aspect of personal liberation, carried by this worldwide popular romantic culture. And this remains the dominant project in the world, but at the same time, it's now a weak project because its votaries no longer know what its next step should be. And then we have this problem that we discussed in the earlier part of the class, that we need to renew this project without depending on the isms, without depending on the idea of the definitive blueprint. And once again, it seems that Chinese philosophy could be useful in that practical project if we could separate it from the this worldly bias. So that's a as it were a positive interpretation. Before I criticize Chinese philosophy. Now I'm asking you whether you would agree with this interpretation of where we have the best chance of finding its positive contribution to the reconstruction of Western philosophy.
Yes, and just to be very brief, we're running out of time. I agree. I mean, it's in the Chinese tradition that you have an absolute commitment, as you said, very much unlike the Western tradition, where it's a minor decision and oftentimes really kind of non-existent, where there's this absolute commitment to the notion that everything is history, everything is temporally bound. You were born into a world that is ever-changing, and even the claim that there are natural laws that are immutable, strong critique of any such notion. And certainly, if there are no natural laws that are unchangeable, there's certainly no realm of ideas that is unchangeable, there are no substances unchangeable, so a strong critique of that. So I agree, I think this is something incredibly important to learn from. And turning to the political project, yes, I mean, here you have an incredibly powerful focus on how you develop a socio-political philosophy that would not only not fall into an ism, but that would see not falling into an ism as one of the specific goals. And I think looking at the gains and losses of the various attempts made is something we could desperately learn from in terms of what I agree is the key thing we need to do, which is to reinvigorate our attempts to change the world in this period when they've become so domesticated for the past several decades. But again, not in a way as in the past year where it's beginning to break apart, but in incredibly dangerous ways. How can we reinvigorate that? And yes, I think there's a huge amount to learn from in terms of the socio-political theories in China. Absolutely.
But is it an ism to be against all isms? We always run into the paradox no matter what.
Indeed.
Ways of life are not isms.
Yeah.
But once you move into critical discourse, and you must, and you're going to end up with certain impasses and paradoxes. So the question is, how do you live it in such a way that you're not captured by the ism, but theoretically you're still tied? And I know it's 3:01, 3 o'clock is arbitrary temporal construct. The conversation can go. No, have a good week. Have a good day. I'll meet you at your office.
That's a fun thing. Peanut butter on the bread.
It makes me think
I